Did any of the following actually happen as described in these scary stories? The Williamstown Werewolf. Dear Scary Stories NYC, I'm writing to you because I encountered either some kind of wolfman or else possibly a dogman in the town of Williamstown, Pennsylvania, just south of State Game Lands 264. In fact, I saw him walk out of town into the game lands themselves. I'll tell you about it. I was driving from west to east on West Broad Street, and as I was passing that pathway into the woods that comes up on your right before you pass the speed limit sign, I saw something that changed my entire life. This is on the northern edge of Williamstown, as I said, butting up directly against State Game Land number 264. The clear-cut pathway into the woods was pretty overgrown back when this story took place, but I saw someone moving through it quickly out of the side of my eye, like it was newly mown grass. By the time I turned my head to look, the figure was already stepping out onto the road, and it was not exactly what I was expecting to see. In fact, it wasn't anything at all like anyone would have ever expected to see. This wasn't a man wearing dark clothes as I had originally presumed. It was something far closer to a Bigfoot, although it wasn't that either. The dark clothes didn't exist. In fact, it didn't have any clothing on at all. It was a bipedal creature entirely covered in dark hair, or more likely fur, and it had already moved out onto the road in front of me. I had been slamming on the brakes since way back when I thought it was a human being, but by the time my car stopped, I was sitting there looking at some kind of a humanoid with a dog head staring back at me through the front windshield. It was a dogman or a werewolf or something along those lines, and it was right out in front of my car. If it had wanted to, it could have placed its hands on my hood without moving even one step closer. I watched as this impossible, yet clearly real, animal man turned all his attention onto me and began screaming like a crazy homeless person directly at my face. Try to put yourself in my position. That was the scariest thing that ever happened to me, at least in Pennsylvania. I got mugged once in Trenton, but this was the worst thing I ever experienced in PA. I really was thinking that this thing was going to get into the car and get at me. It had muscles on its muscles. It looked like it could tear my car apart with its bare hands. And maybe it really could have. This was a dark, hairy animal that had to be over 6 feet tall when it stood up. Bent over and shouting at me may have technically made it shorter, but it felt even larger as I witnessed the utter hatred in its eyes and the completely savage attitude it was taking toward me and my car. I'm not sure if at first it might have thought my car was a living thing itself, because its roar was directed at the front fender of the vehicle. When it looked up and noticed me behind the windshield, its white, glowing eyes opened much wider in surprise. I hear stories about Dogman barking at people. This one did not. It bellowed like a large caveman might. I don't think he was using language except in the most primitive sense. I got the message loud and clear anyway, and backed the car away from him. At first slowly, then faster. I'm not sure how far away I was before he was satisfied that I was granting him enough space to be respectful, but he was off in the distance. I saw him grow bored with me and return to his path north toward the game lands. I never saw an animal before that demanded to be respected and given his space. Maybe that's something gorillas or lions do, but nothing that I know of in Pennsylvania will take that kind of an attitude. This thing clearly thought of himself as king of the forest and seemed quite unaccustomed to dealing with humans. That's kind of why I don't think the game lands are where it originated from. There are human hunters in there all the time. He would have been more used to seeing us if he came from up north of Williamstown. Of course, the same can be said for any place in the eastern United States that lies south of the town, too. It's almost as though the Dogman walked in from another planet or another time. Could it live underground somehow? That would presuppose an entire ecosystem existing outside of our awareness, underneath our feet. Many have imagined such a place, but if anyone has proven its existence, I'm unaware of it. I don't mean tunnel systems, because I know that lots of natural and manufactured tunnels exist under this country. I'm not talking about the Dogman coming from another part of the U.S. via an underground passageway. I'm wondering if there is any place under the ground where he might have been born and raised. That would mean there would have to also be water there, prey animals, and therefore vegetation for the prey animals to eat. So it's a far-fetched assumption. The thing is, I am talking about how this creature seemed to have never seen a human being or a car before. That means I am, literally, looking for an origin for the Dogman that would be a place that human beings do not go and would likely be unaware of. Whether he came from another dimension, or time, or physical place within the earth, I just don't believe he could have grown up anywhere on the surface of the earth in Pennsylvania. He would certainly have seen humans long before he grew into adulthood. Another possibility that occurred to me was, what if this was not an adult I saw? After all, just because it was 6 foot tall or so, taller than I am, that does not mean it was necessarily an adult. Maybe this was a young one. Maybe it was just 9 months or a year old, for all I know. It's not impossible for a puppy being raised in a remote part of PA to go 10 months or a year without seeing a human, assuming he had a mother or family who protected and sheltered and raised him for a large part of that time. Again, I'm making wild assumptions since the only actual data I have to go on is my brief experience of being bellowed at. All the rest is guesswork and extrapolation. It's funny how you can spend the rest of your life going over something that took up such a short time in real life to happen to you. As frightening as that moment was for me, it's still probably the most exciting thing that ever happened in my life as well. I won't exactly say I want to see it again, but on the other hand, if I had other people with me next time, maybe I actually would. I won't go Dogman hunting for it or anything like that, but when I drive in the area over there, I do keep on high alert, looking all around me. I hope someone, somewhere, can find proof, whether it's me or not. I would like to somehow establish the reality of the creature that I have named the Williamstown Werewolf. Don't go anywhere. We've still got to tell you the story that's on this episode's thumbnail. But first, a moment for a rhyme. Our executive producer is Joe A. Rivas, risen to the challenge. That's what he has done. He helps us mow and mow. Last name Rivas, first name Joe. Please join us in thanking Joe A. Rivas, the newest $7 member of our PayPal subscribers club at peterbernard.com. We thank Mr. Rivas for his kind donation by sending him links to our secret, uncensored Sunday subscriber-only stories, which are far too wild to ever run on this channel. He also gets access to our archive of over 15 hours of scary, uncensored Dogman stories, and you can too. Just do what Joe A. Rivas did and join our PayPal subscribers club at peterbernard.com at the $3 level or above. Another option is to click the join link under this or any of our videos. And now, let's jump right into our second Dogman story of the episode. This is the one shown in the thumbnail today, and we call it The Wolfman. in sheep's clothing. Dear Scary Stories NYC. Back when I was young, my dad was working as a sheep farmer. Somebody, somehow, was stealing his sheep without anybody being able to figure out who, where, when, or why. I got assigned the job, and I sat there, watching sheep, seeing nothing but sheep. I finally got bored and decided to walk away and get myself some food. But I heard a weird sound behind me, so I looked back. And what did I see? I saw an incredibly large, bipedal man-like thing carrying a sheep under his arm. The sheep was still and quiet. For some reason I couldn't tell. It was just allowing itself to be carried off. I don't know if the Dogman had used some sort of hypnosis on the poor thing, or if possibly it may have already caused its demise before carrying it off. But either way, the sheep hung there silently as I watched it being taken away. I was horrified. Horrified. I was watching some kind of giant man with the head of Anubis carry my sheep off casually as though he had purchased him at the market. When I say giant, I don't mean 8 feet tall. The long-snouted black dog head was at least 12 feet up off the ground. My first reaction was not that I was witnessing a monster. It was that I was witnessing an ancient pagan god. The kind of god that does not emanate love and kindness, but rather the kind that demands offerings and sacrifices, but might decide to smite you anyway. This being was not clothed as a god, at least not how they show them in the movies. He was completely unclothed, although who is to say a god would not do that? Covered in dark black fur from head to foot, with tall Anubis-like ears on top of its head. I saw it walking from a 3/4 behind angle. The legs were like the hind legs of a dog in appearance, yet it seemed to walk like a man walks. I don't even know exactly what I mean, but it did not walk the way a dog on its hind legs would. Does that make any sense? It wasn't like a man walking on his toes the way Lon Chaney used to do it either. It was like a huge man going on his way, except the legs bent differently. It or he did not have a tail. It had a butt in the same way humans do, or very similar at least. Its back looked more human than canine, and led up to giant-sized versions of shoulders one would expect to see on a professional basketball player. Would you want to follow after that? Remember, the sheep under his arm was an adult. This was a very large, whatever it was. I didn't want to go after it either, but the sheep were my dad's business, and this was the one responsible for destroying that business. I had to follow him. It was the entire reason I was out there that night in the first place. So, scared out of my mind and shaking all over, I tentatively began following the half-canine, half-humanoid giant. I almost began praying in my head, but then I stopped. What if he really was a god? That he might intercept my prayer and come back to get me. I barely walked more than 30 or 40 feet in the direction of the retreating Dogman when he sensed me and whipped around suddenly. I was stunned to see its eyes glowing in the darkness like a special effect in a movie. Those glowing orbs looked suddenly furious, and I watched as it shifted its body language into a fierce pose. It began barking at me, sounding like a junkyard dog using a PA system. His barking echoed all around, hurting my ears as I ran back the way I came, in utter terror. Another thing is that the Dogman somehow hid itself among the sheep. I looked at the field, and I had only seen the sheep. I never saw the Dogman, yet it had to have already been there. How did I not see it? I was there, watching the herd, for a half hour, and that Dogman only walked away with the sheep when I turned to look in the other direction. It doesn't even make sense. unless the Dogman had some very special ability to camouflage itself. That seemed to be the most logical explanation that I could come up with. But when I told this story the next day to my dad, he reminded me of that old phrase, wolf in sheep's clothing. He told me that was what we had going on. We had a wolf that was somehow able to disguise itself as a sheep. He didn't just seem like a sheep to the other sheep to prevent them from getting alarmed at his presence. He was apparently also able to appear as a sheep even to human beings. Dad gave me chills all over talking like that, but I refused to believe it, at least not literally. I do agree that figuratively the Dogman was like a wolf in sheep's clothing, but I'm sure he did not literally appear as a sheep when I looked around the field. There had to be a far simpler answer. Maybe he hid behind 2 or 3 sheep. Maybe he just lay on the ground perfectly still for all that time. I guess those answers sound almost as implausible as my father's solution to the puzzle. For whatever reason, the kidnappings of the sheep stopped after that night. I don't suppose we'll ever really understand the truth behind the wolf man in sheep's clothing. The wolf man in the weeds. Dear Scary Stories NYC. When I was a teenager, my friends and I used to hang out in the tall weeds and do things that teenagers didn't want their parents to know that they did. There were 2 different occasions that we saw the Dogman there, and I'll try to remember as many details as I can about it. A few of my old buddies in this story still live in that town, 2 of them in the same houses that they lived in back then. This was a long time ago, in the early 1970s. Some of my buddies never strayed far from there in all their lives, God bless them. I am not at liberty to divulge the location of this story, but let's say it happened in one of the mid-Atlantic states. Our town was actually fairly large, but we lived on the outskirts of it, in a neighborhood that consisted of working-class families in small houses, spaced fairly far apart by modern standards. Even today, it's more sparsely populated than the rest of town, or, well, at least it was before COVID. I haven't actually physically been back there since late 2019. This is a summer story. It happened when it was very warm out. The tall grass we would hang out in was a field probably as large as a baseball field, or almost. It was unused land, almost all of which was covered by grass that I remember being about 4 or 4.5 feet tall when it was at its height in the summer. We would go out in the field and seem to disappear from view to anyone outside of the field or back on the street merely by sitting down on any random dirt patch inside. If we stood up, we'd be back in view, but sitting down made us the invisible men, or the invisible boys at least. The first time we saw the Dogman, it was getting later in the afternoon. When we looked up in the sky, it was beginning to look darker and a slightly different shade of blue. That's why when we heard heavy footsteps and grass rustling getting closer and closer, we thought it was one of our fathers come to yell at us for not being home for dinner or something like that. We could tell already, sitting there, by the thumping sound in the earth that we could feel in the seat of our pants, that this was not one of our moms. This was someone quite large. Instead of standing up, we got quiet and slunk down even lower than before. We were teenagers, halfway to adulthood, but still partially like kids mentally. And we were all afraid of our fathers at the time. No offense, Dad, if you're up there listening. The thumping grew closer and closer until I felt like my heart was going to beat out of my chest. Whoever it was, they were about to walk right into us. We were about to be seen, and there was nothing we could do about it. Only when we were, inevitably, discovered, it wasn't by any of our dads. As you already have guessed, it was by a big old Dogman, incredibly tall. He didn't look like a wolf. He had floppy ears. If anything, imagine Clifford the dog, because that's what we called him. He was a giant dog, but he walked on his hind legs. His front paws were held out in front of him, like he was begging for a dog bone or something like that. He did not have monster claws. He had dog paws. He was in every way a giant 7 or 8 foot tall floppy-eared dog, but he appeared completely comfortable walking on his hind legs. We screamed like little girls and ran home, the big old dog barking at us angrily but not giving chase. I think we startled him as much as he startled us. Believe it or not, this did not deter us from doing our thing in the tall grass. After all, we heard him coming a long time before he reached us, so we just reasoned that the next time we heard him, we'd split a lot sooner and it would be no sweat. In fact, that's exactly what happened. The only other time we saw him, we heard the thump, thump, thump sound, and we were like, uh-oh. Standing up immediately this time, we saw him off in the distance, the same Dogman as before, or else his identical twin brother, and we just got out of there before he was anywhere near us. I do remember that we eventually did stop sitting in the tall grass, but it had nothing to do with the Dogman. One of us got Rocky Mountain spotted fever from ticks in that grass, and we were all too scared to go back in there ever again. If you don't know about Rocky Mountain spotted fever, it makes you sick. You can lose your hearing. It can lead to you having to lose your limbs. It's incredibly scary, trust me. My friend came out of it mostly okay, but it could have gone the other way if it hadn't been discovered soon enough. We didn't need to be told to stay out of the grasses from then on. We just avoided them ourselves. And so you can see, it wasn't the tall and mighty Dogman that ended our summer fun. It was the tiny, seemingly insignificant bug we call a tick that reprogrammed all our behavior and ended up being the ultimate king of all nature in our town in the early 1970s. And that's all this old man can remember anymore about. The Wolfman. In the weeds.
Thanks for watching till the end. If you liked what you saw, please consider clicking like on the video or sharing it. You can become a channel member by clicking the join link below. Then you can check our community page to find the links to 10 hours or more of secret, uncensored Dogman stories too wild to be told on this channel. Your other option is to join our paid subscribers club at peterbernard.com. That's Peter's homemade club, where he will personally email you the links as well as occasional secret club messages. You may also be included as an executive producer in a future episode. If you have a scary experience you want to tell us about, you can email us at scarystoriesnyc@gmail.com, or else call our Scary Stories voicemail hotline at 804-LESS-SCARY. The machine cuts off every few minutes, so if you have a long story, please keep calling back and we'll piece it together later on. Good night, and have a scary tomorrow.
Come back for more scary stories.